Hi, my name is Dan Livesay, and I teach early American history at Claremont McKenna College. And I want to talk about a book that transformed my life. So when I was 20 years old, I was a junior in college studying history, and at the time I had a pretty narrow sense about what history was. I mostly just took classes about warfare and about revolution and the people that led them. Because in my mind at the time, I thought that that's all that really mattered in history, and those are the only things that actually changed societies. And I would have continued to think that had I not been assigned a really important book called The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. And this was a book that not only changed the way that I thought about what history was, but also what history could do and what you could learn from it. And so it was really instrumental in directing me towards an entirely different way of thinking about the past. So when I picked up the book, I was a little bit confused because it had the term Jacobins in it, and I recognized that term. I knew that it was associated with the French Revolution to some degree, but I wasn't sure why the word black was in front of it. So I started reading, and I quickly realized that this was a history of the Haitian Revolution. Now, at the time, I had never heard of the Haitian Revolution, and if I'm totally honest, I probably couldn't have identified where Haiti was on a map. I was just pretty ignorant at that time about that area of the world. But to quickly summarize what the Haitian Revolution was, it's one of the most important events in modern world history, and it's the only successful slave revolution in world history, in the sense that enslaved people were able to free themselves and create a new free state. And they emerged out of a colonial experience. Haiti, before it became independent, was a French colony called Saint-Domingue. And for almost 200 years, it was a slave colony run by the French that produced sugar. And sugar in the 18th century was one of the most profitable crops in the world. And Saint-Domingue, even though it's a tiny little piece of land in the Caribbean, it was one of the wealthiest places in the world. Now, well over 1 million Africans were taken against their will to Saint-Domingue and forced to work on plantations and in really brutal conditions harvesting sugar. And they made huge fortunes for the white men and women that owned them. And so in 1791, small groups of individuals rose up to demand more rights. They eventually started to come together, and soon a full-fledged enslaved rebellion sprang up. And it took 13 years, but eventually these enslaved revolutionaries were successful, and they defeated the French, and they established the free nation of Haiti. It's a really tremendous story, and I advise everyone to kind of look into it a little bit more, and The Black Jacobins is a great place to start. And it chronicles this history in lots of vivid detail, and I was really kind of enraptured by that story. But James's narrative also did 3 really important things for me, and it taught me 3 really important lessons that I still have and I still carry with me today. The first is that it showed that slavery as an institution and enslaved people have a history. And it's not just that this was a horrific stain in world history, which it was, but that it was a dynamic and a complicated institution, and that the people that suffered under it led very complicated and dynamic lives as well, and that we can actually study their lives. We don't have to just kind of look at it with shame. We can look at it to try to piece together what those experiences were like. The second thing is that it showed that enslaved people thought and acted politically, both through their actions and also their demands. We saw through the Haitian Revolution how the most brutalized people in an enslaved society can still engage critically with their world, and they can still have very sophisticated attitudes towards their own oppression and even towards the pathways to their own freedom. And the final thing is that it really showed how important slavery was in world history. And it's not just that it subjugated so many people, but it also contributed significantly to the wealth of the Western world and also the development of the Western world. So slavery is not a peripheral story in the history of the West. It's absolutely central and critical to it. And those are lessons that I still carry with me today, and they really kind of orient the way I see the past and kind of inform the research and the history that I'm most interested in looking at. So whether you study history professionally or you just take one class in it, remember that you might just come across a book that will change your life forever.